So as mentioned before, this training is an 8-hour training for our direct service providers that focuses on the dynamics of domestic violence and how we're indigenizing offender accountability, also known as that or intervention. We're going to go over some information sharing, some Indigenous perspectives related to BIP, and what are those trauma-informed best practices? What is accountability defined? And the safety and violence prevention for future generations. This audience is specifically for direct service providers, but I do understand that we do have some community advocates or folks who might be in related fields, and you certainly are welcome to be in space with us today as well. At the end of this training, we will have a survey. In order to receive your certificate, you do need to take our survey. So you can take that today, but we'll also email that out after the training so that you're able to also get a copy of the survey. So the objectives for our training today is a little bit lengthy, but we're going to get to all of it. So it's going to be spread out pretty evenly throughout the agenda. We want to go over the basic understanding and dynamics of domestic violence, take a little bit about what that cycle of power and control looks like, toxic masculinity and the impacts of colonization. A second, we'll also be able to identify, recognize, and the origins of violence and what does intergenerational trauma look like, attitudes, beliefs, and values about violence. We also want to work towards having an understanding of what constitutes basic human inherent rights from an Indigenous perspective and how that relates to victim safety and treating offenders utilizing humanistic principles. We also want to be able to recognize the importance of addressing offender motivation to engage in the intervention change process. Number 5, we want to be able to recognize the importance of culturally competent and appropriate responses. And last but not least, we want to define what a community coordinated response can look like in response to domestic violence, victim safety, offender accountability, and utilizing restorative practices. We have a wonderful agenda of 3 trainers who have amazing experience in this area of BIP. We have Mr. Clifford Jack, Mr. Rod Cascala, as well as Caroline Daly, with several years of knowledge and experience in working in this area. So before we get started into the first piece of the training, we titled this training Building a Decolonized and Restorative Approach for Persons Causing Harm for different reasons. I think we're shifting our views and how we approach and also look at this subject. So if you want to answer these prompts, that's great. If you could drop that into the chat, but also I would encourage folks to take yourself off mute. The first question is, what are your expectations for this training? And the second question is more to help us gauge where folks are at. So let us know how we can support you in your learning today. Would anyone like to come off mute and answer the prompts? And again, you're more than welcome to drop that into the chat as well. And I'll give that a couple of seconds because I know these are kind of bigger questions, right? And folks might be typing into the chat. And would anyone like to share?
Hi, everyone. My name is Victoria Benjamin. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I serve as a confidential advocate at the Women and Gender Advocacy Center at Colorado State University. So expectations for this training, one of those is here on the university, we've recently had folks try to approach interpersonal violence from a restorative lens, and that's an option for survivors when they are engaging a university reporting process. And so I suppose I'd like to know more about it, and there's been some pieces of that for me personally that I feel like may not be the most supportive for survivors. And so I'm hoping to gain some knowledge about a decolonizing restorative approach from an Indigenous lens to see kind of how that's playing out and if we could improve experiences for survivors on campus, Indigenous survivors specifically. So that's one expectation for the training there. And I think to support me, I'm here to learn. So I'll take a position of learner and go from there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, and welcome. Okay, looking at the chat here. Page expectations, restorative accountability practices that can be implemented to interrupt the reproduction of the oppression of colonization. Thank you for that. And Jackie says, hoping to gain a deeper understanding of Indigenous approaches to working with those who do harm. Perfect. Awesome. See, Brenda here says, my expectations for this training are just to learn as much as I can and then implement that knowledge in my work area. Great. Thank you so much for that.
I would just add to what other people have shared. And hi, folks. My name is Taryn Henning, she, her. I work at the University of Kentucky in Lexington, Kentucky. And echoing a lot of what other folks have said, wanting to learn more around some more kind of restorative justice approaches, but really with the focus of decolonized approaches. That's something for me that I've been working on doing a lot of unlearning a lot of things that have stemmed from colonization. And I also personally am very excited and looking forward to being a learner in ways that in my work I can be more culturally appropriate for any of our Indigenous survivors we may be serving.
Thank you so much, Taryn. I love that you said unlearning. I think that's definitely something I personally have been engaging in a lot of, right? Especially when we think about folks who cause harm, a lot of times are criminalized or are at times sometimes looked at as disposable. So it's like a lot of unlearning and applying humanistic approaches to the subject area. So yeah, thank you so much for naming that, Taryn. Here. So with that, and before we get started, and I just want to make sure that we're going at a comfortable pace, I wanted to give folks a chance to get ready before we move into this next piece. So I'm going to give you all a quick 5-minute break, and then we're going to go ahead and get started into the first presentation, which is just going to do a little bit of the dynamics, but also if I'm alrighty, let's go ahead and get started. So the first piece of this training, we want to make sure that we understand what domestic violence is. And I know we have a lot of providers that have an understanding of what that can look like. So consider this a refresher course, but also relatives that are new to this area, I hope you're able to absorb as much information as possible. These slides will be shared with you. Tatiana is going to drop that into the chat so that you have it as well. So the Coalition to Stop Violence is an award-winning organization, just want to highlight that, who, at the forefront of taking a dynamic approach to tribal and domestic and sexual violence. Our service area, as you can see on this map, is the state of New Mexico and the Four Corners region. As you can see, they're highlighted in purple. We also service the Isleta Pueblo del Sur in El Paso, Texas. The 4 main focus areas that our coalition highlights, the first thing is training. For instance, this training we're having today, we try to focus on building the capacity of our service providers, as well as community advocates, and even our community members on the ground that are engaged in community organizing or who are finding community-based solutions. So we want to make sure that we're building those capacities at all levels. And I just saw the chat highlight, so let me make sure Okay, good, good. Make sure there's no questions for me. So this is our service area. The second is our technical assistance. Our technical assistance, in addition to building capacity, is that we want to support other organizations, tribal communities, those who are looking at ways to build their own programming. So we are able to provide that technical assistance as well. We're also building out our policy advocacy area. We are excited to be bringing on a policy director soon. And one of our staff is actually going to be transitioning under policy, which is really cool. So we want to make sure that we're keeping our communities, our tribal leaders, our advocates informed at the state, tribal, and federal levels. We also provide support. We have a wonderful advocate program that our advocate coordinator, Tiffany Harone, oversees, where we want to make sure that our advocates and our providers are supported in many ways, as well as community. Some of that support looks like advocate meetings. If you are a member with our coalition, which you are more than welcome to sign up for, you'll have access to being prioritized for trainings, being invited into our member meetings where you're able to see, get updates on what's going on with the coalition, as well as like events that we hold. So that's just a little bit about who we are. Some of the strategies that we utilize is that we want to share knowledge and real life experiences that demonstrate this magnitude of what violence looks like in our tribal communities and how our providers, first responders can best support our survivors and families. The second approach that we want to take is leveraging the knowledge and relationships that we have, which is our people. We want to make sure that we build and maintain trust as a framework for support. We value relationship building and ensuring that we leverage those networks that support survivors, but also expands resources that our members and our communities can get access to as well. We also look to our future. We feel like it's important to be very mindful in laying this groundwork for survivors so that they feel supported and safe in a very culturally resilient, culturally competent manner, so that it creates a space of empowerment. So looking at the state of New Mexico, there are nearly 229,000 American Indian and Alaska Natives. This is a very Indigenous dense area. So we have about 23 tribal nations, which looks like 19 Pueblos, 3 Apache tribes, and the Navajo Nation. So tribal nations make up approximately 11% of the population in New Mexico. And in the Albuquerque metro area, there's about 55,000 American Indian and Alaska Natives that currently live in Albuquerque. I know we have some relatives that are beaming in outside of our service area. That is certainly fine. But just want to make it clear also that we're not a direct service provider. And we do try to make sure that we provide support services within the state of New Mexico. I think many of us are very familiar with these national statistics, and as we know, there's a high rate of violence that is committed against our Indigenous women, which is 4 and 5. In terms of sexual violence, that's a little over 56% of our population. More than 1.5 million Native women have experienced some form of violence in their lifetime. I won't go through all of the statistics, but again, you'll have a copy of these slides. And these come from reports, UCR reports, as well as a couple of studies that we have access to. Let's see here, we got a chat here. Oh, okay. In terms of sexual violence in tribal communities, over 60% of crimes in New Mexico occur in tribal communities, and 1 in 3 Native women have experienced some form of sexual violence in New Mexico. So we want to also acknowledge the violence that occurs towards our LGBTQ and trans and Two-Spirit relatives, because this happens within their community as well. I like to share this quote from Lenny Hayes, who is a Two-Spirit advocate from South Dakota. And Lenny says, while there is no accurate data that represents the rates of domestic and sexual violence that occurs within the Two-Spirit and Native LGBTQ community, it occurs all the same. Unfortunately, this lack of data creates the false idea that domestic violence and sexual violence are not experienced within this community. What we want to highlight is that domestic and sexual violence does not discriminate. Violence against our transgender, queer, two-spirit relatives is not traditional. Historically, and even today, our two-spirit relatives were highly honored in many Native societies and continue to be honored, and that reconnection is happening. Some of the domestic violence tactics can be very similar to heterosexual relationships. However, there are some exceptions. For an example, outing someone. When someone is outed, this means that they're telling others the victim's gender identity or their sexual orientation without their consent. I know a lot of times folks have this habit of revealing someone's gender identity, maybe like in casual conversation. Some of the implications that come with that is that it can be dangerous. This is also a tactic that's utilized by abusers who may out a victim, which can place them in more danger. And this can increase the likelihood of additional violence from others, especially if they learn of their gender identity. So all that to say is that our Native LGBTQ and transgender and two-spirit relatives still hold honorable and meaningful places in our communities, and they deserve to feel safe, they deserve to feel loved and respected like everyone else. And we also talk about being a good relative, which means being inclusive in all of our spaces. You can honor our relatives by asking for their pronouns. If you heard earlier, Tatiana asked folks to, if you'd like to add your pronouns to your name, that certainly is encouraged. Additionally, using gender neutral terms for survivors instead of just using the word she is also helpful. And this is just a reminder that, domestic and sexual violence does not discriminate. For folks that are starting to work with tribal communities, I'm not law trained, so I'm not going to go into this very deep, but I just want to say that jurisdiction does play a role when working with tribal communities. Tribal nations have a political status, so they have the authority to oversee their lands. They're able to manage their own government infrastructures and services like public safety, education, public health, and social services. But a lot of that can be limited, and that's true in the case due to the ex parte crow dog, which is a whole other subject. So just want to put that awareness out there that jurisdiction also plays a role of violence in our communities. So we're going to get into some of the historical the root causes of violence. Does anyone know what this painting is? Feel free to drop it in the chat, or if you feel called to come off mute, you can tell me what this picture is.
Manifest Destiny.
Yes, exactly. Thank you, Mr. Jack. This is the picture of Manifest Destiny. It depicts the westward expansion, which was a 19th century settler colonial doctrine that the expansion of the US throughout the American continents was both justified and inevitable. So if you look at this picture, you see relatives here running away from the settlers coming in. You see the telephone lines coming in, farmers, miners, as well as the industrialization that you see back here as well. You see how this light is pushing out this darkness. And this was just the settler colonial way of illustrating what they felt like was a justified expansion onto Indigenous lands through the utilization of colonization and genocide. So one thing that's really important, one question that we get a lot is, why does violence happen in our communities? Where is it coming from? And a lot of the on the surface answers that folks get or say is, oh, it's due to alcohol, it's due to drugs, it's due to unemployment, it's due to, lateral violence. But if we were to really take a really deep look into how these systems play a role that have perpetuated these areas to fester violence, it's really important that we understand the historical context and the impacts of colonization. When we think about colonization, we think about the perpetuation of the murdering, genocide, and patriarchal systems that have factored into what we know as settler colonialism. Indigenous peoples were erased through outright genocide, assimilation, and even processes of interbreeding through rape. And this created racialized categories that became important for perpetuating this system. Settler colonialism is not a vicious thing of the past, which we hear a lot, right? They say it happened in the past, so get over it. Sorry about that, my cat needs attention. But as long as settlers are living on appropriated land, on stolen land, this will continue to exist in our communities today. So with settler colonialism, we recognize that it is, that invasion is a structure and it's not one single event. Things like the gold rush, the silver rush, the race to the West. It was more than that. And that led up to the development of systemic racism that were implemented into our community. So there's two pieces of systemic racism, the first being institutional. This is the systematic distribution of resources, power, and opportunity in our society to the benefit of people who are white and exclude our Black, Indigenous, and persons of color. Examples of institutional racism are things like the wealth gap, food insecurity, housing insecurity, the lack of environmental justice, and high incarceration rates of our BIPOC relatives. So institutional is the distribution of resources that do not benefit Black and Indigenous folks. Structural racism is a system of hierarchy and inequity, which is primarily characterized by white supremacy. This is the preferential treatment, privilege, and power for white people at the expense of Black and Indigenous people. This includes things like public policy and practices that historically worked against Black and Indigenous people. And these policies look like Jim Crow laws, boarding schools, the implementation of reservations, and the so-called Indian problem, as well as assimilative tactics and the Dawes Act. So these structures that were put in place began to create these environments of violence against our Native women. This included sex trafficking. Christopher Columbus is a known trafficker. So this happened way beyond what we know trafficking is as today. This led to the murder of our women, the femicide and forced sterilization, and some of those policies and tactics that were utilized towards our women. What we should also recognize is that colonization is genocide, and that this is the first power and control model on a massive scale, and that we recognize hierarchy is not natural. What I also want to say is that through all of this, especially to our Indigenous relatives here in this space, is that we are a very strong people. And despite all of these structures that are in place, we continue to move forward, we continue to survive, we continue to thrive. So please keep that in mind as we hear some of these more daunting information that are known. So another piece that came out of colonization is what we know as gender-based violence. This reflects the idea that violence often serves to maintain structural gender inequalities. And this historically, several Native societies, of course, were matrilineal, and they honored our women, and they continue to be matrilineal today. They honored our women, they honored our children, our transgender relatives, and our queer and two-spirit relatives. However, with gender-based violence, it was a targeted violence against these groups that I named earlier. A piece of gender-based violence came from the system of patriarchy, which is a system or society or even a government in which white men hold power and women are largely excluded from it. Generally, women were treated as chattel or they experienced many forms of abuse. What we also recognize is the heterosexual privileges that that men in society had hold. So it's a socio-political system where primarily cisgender males have authority over women, folks of varying gender identities, and those who are non-heterosexual orientations. So this is a term that emphasizes the discrimination of our women and our genderqueer relatives who are also victimized by the same sexist social principles that are things like misogyny, sexism. And I think Mr. Jack and Mr. Cascala are going to go over those concepts later on in the training, so I'm not going to spend too much time explaining that piece of it. But we also understand that this type of violence is also influenced by those gender relations, and it promotes the westernized stereotypes of men as socially dominant. I think to adequately address this violence, cultural and societal issues that encourage violence as part of masculinity need to be eradicated. So how can we do this? And I think that's one of the questions that we'll talk about today. When we talk about folks causing harm, I think we recognize that our male relatives tend to be the folks who are causing this harm. But I also want to acknowledge that this harm is also caused by women and folks who from different gender identities. So, but that's not as significant as the rates of our male relatives. So I know sometimes we get that question, like, why don't we include our women who are also abusers? Why don't we include our non-binary or transgender relatives? And well, one, I haven't had data on it, to be honest, but also we just want to ensure that where the significance of this violence is happening, that this is also a part of that conversation. So it's not to exclude anyone before we get that question. Additionally, the history of sexual violence and genocide of Native women illustrates how gender violence functions as a tool for racism and colonialism. And we also recognize that Native women have been the primary focus of sexual violence just because of our ability to give birth. If you know, there are policies right now that are looking to continue to control relatives who are able to give birth, to control their bodies through policies that are not allowing folks access to reproductive health, to abortion support. And so I just kind of want to illustrate that as well, that relatives that have the ability to give birth are generally targeted. Historically, of course, Indigenous bodies were viewed as dirty. They were viewed as disposable. I think when folks ask us about the missing and murdered crisis, that could just be the best way we can explain it, of like, why is this happening to our relatives out there? I also want to acknowledge that as well as in the 1830s, President Andrew Jackson engaged in what was called the Indian Removal Act. This campaign was specifically set up to systematically target women and children and also utilize the tactic of interbreeding through forced rape. This was to illustrate the symbolic and literal control over Black and brown bodies at that time. Relatives from the Creek Nation, the 5 civilized tribes, were forcefully removed from their lands and ultimately led to what we know as the Trail of Tears. But the Indian Removal Act continued to spread throughout the United States. And again, it was just a way to control how we move in this world. So this type of violence is also influenced by our gender relations. And this is kind of where like toxic masculinity comes in. This promotes that westernized stereotype of men as socially dominant, along with related traits such as misogynistic, homophobic, and transphobic behavior. And we call it toxic due in part because of the promotion of violence, rape culture, and sexual violence. The socialization of our young boys often normalizes this violence. I think many of us have heard the term, boys will be boys, or our young girls are just trained to tolerate that kind of abuse at a very young age. I know when I was younger, I had a little boy who picked on me all the time. I remember he kicked me in the shin, and I remember my white female teacher said to me, he just likes you and you're the bigger person in this. So what that taught me was, one, I had to control my own emotions, and that I had to be responsible for how I react. But the socialization is that our boys were able to get away with those types of behaviors. So just to kind of illustrate what we mean by how that can normalize gender-based violence. Also, to adequately address this violence, we need to encourage what is healthy masculinity and what does that look like. Additionally, gender norms have served to set social expectations associated with masculinity and femininity as a binary system. But we know that the binary system does not align with a lot of our cultural and traditional ways of life in our native nations. What we know now is that Western society is catching up on these concepts that have existed long before colonization has taken place. So again, it's really important that when we talk about gender-based violence, that we honor all identities, especially in our tribal communities and in the work that we're doing. So thinking about how violence towards especially our women specifically, historically, how it has affected our communities, it was also recognized that targeting our women was a tactic to try to eradicate nations. And I love this proverb because I think this was the strength of our nations, was our women, was our children, was our transgender relatives and non-binary relatives that really uplifted and kept our nation so resilient. So I wanted to share this quote with you. A nation is not conquered until the hearts of its women are on the ground. Then it's finished, no matter how brave its warriors or how strong their weapons. And that's just to serve as a reminder, especially to our Indigenous relatives, that we are strong and that we're resilient and that we should not forget this. And I love this picture because it's a picture of my good friend Tiffany, who's also our advocate coordinator with her two daughters. And Tiffany is a former direct service provider and has certainly given so much inspiration. And when I thought of this quote, she was one of the first women that I thought of. So I think a lot of our Native women and trans and queer relatives who are carrying this work, we should all be so proud. And we will continue to thrive so long as our women are existing in our communities, teaching and sharing knowledge and raising our babies. And I'm just so confident that our futures are going to be safer because of these amazing folks that are working towards protecting our communities and the love and compassion that they have for our people. Whew, that felt so good to say. Okay. So now we're going to get into the dynamics of domestic violence. Can someone tell me, you can text, or you can drop it into the chat, or if you like to take yourself off mute, what is domestic violence?
Jolene,
Yes.
it's not a singular event, but a ongoing event that's insidious problem deeply rooted in our culture.
Yes. Yes, that's a great answer. Thank you for sharing that, Mr. Jack. Anybody else?
It's power and control.
Exactly. Thank you so much for that, Tiffany. So what we know as domestic violence, there's two pieces that are very related. Domestic violence is one or multiple types of abuse, which can be physical, emotional, verbal, sexual, financial, or economic, cultural, spiritual, or even digital abuse aimed at a relative living within the same home. This pattern of abuse can take place in relationships where couples are dating, married, living together, have a child together, or after the relationship has ended. Also, domestic violence can include violence perpetrated by family members or folks living in the same household as the victim. Oh, sorry, I lost my place in my notes. Intimate partner violence is a form of domestic violence that happens when a current or former spouse or intimate partner engages in a repetitive, fear-inducing pattern of abuse towards their partner to maintain power and control in a relationship. The vast majority of our victims of intimate partner violence are women, with primarily male offenders. Let me check the chat here. Thank you, Lindsay. Yes. Yes, Emily, thank you for that. Yes, Mr. Jack, it is definitely a crime. So many folks are familiar with the power and control wheel. And we recognize that the Duluth model has been very integral. It's very informative in how we look at the power and control structure. For the reasons for this training, we utilize the intimate partner violence triangle. And this is a model that was developed by the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center to really illustrate this unnatural phenomenon that's characterized by a pattern of actions that an individual uses to intentionally control or dominate their intimate partner. And the triangle is more of like a hierarchy, which we understand is an unnatural power and control. And that's at the foundation of this triangle. And the reasons why we don't utilize or recognize utilizing the circle, if I remember correctly, from Gwen from NIWRC, is that the circle itself is a symbol that many tribal communities recognize as healing, as we recognize the sun, the moon, the cycle of life in a circular way. And we felt like it wasn't appropriate to utilize that shape when explaining the power dynamic, which is more of a hierarchy. And you'll all get a copy of the this worksheet as well. So the person causing harm will utilize threats or intimidation and coercion to instill fear into their partner. These behaviors are within this triangle that you see. The physical and sexual violence holds it all together, which are at the outside of the triangle. And the foundation of the triangle, as mentioned before, is that unnatural power and control. There's no particular order within this triangle, but we recognize that male privilege is a part of this. We talked a little bit about the system of patriarchy as well as toxic masculinity and what that looks like, and how those concepts of colonization, especially patriarchal notions of men being the head of household or men having control over property, and that women are in a more subservient role. And that's a piece of that. We also recognize that isolation is a tactic of power and control. This would be controlling where the survivor goes, what they see, who they talk to, what they read, limiting their outside involvement, and will also utilize jealousy to justify actions. So an example of that would be, I only reacted that way because I love you. I'm only doing this because I love you. I'm looking out for you. Intimidation. This would make the survivor feel afraid. This could be through a look across the room. This could be an action. This could be a gesture. They could use things to throw against the wall, destroy property, as well as even abusing pets or displaying weapons. These are forms of intimidation that are used to control and to maintain power over a survivor. Emotional abuse. They use this tactic. As you know, many of our relatives that are in domestic violence situation is love. Like there's still love there. A survivor will continue to have that emotional attachment to the abuser, and abusers will leverage this by emotional abuse by putting her down, gaslighting, making them feel bad about themselves, calling them names, making them feel like they're crazy, or playing mind games, or humiliating the survivor, or making them feel guilty for the situation that they're in. It also utilizes minimization, lying, and blaming. This makes light of the abuse and doesn't take the survivor's concerns seriously. They say the abuse didn't happen, or they shift that responsibility for the abusive behavior onto the survivor, saying that they caused it, saying that they were the reason why they acted out violently. They'll also utilize children. This could be using them to relay messages, making them feel bad about their parenting, using the time that they visit with the children to harass the survivor, or threatening to take away the children, threatening to take custody. There's also economic abuse. This prevents the survivor from working. They may have her ask for money from the abuser, or or the abuser controls the finances. They may only give them an allowance for certain things, but also maybe taking her money when she gets paid, but also not letting the survivor know or have access to that, to the family income. Coercion and threats. This makes and/or carries the threats to do something to hurt the survivor. They may threaten to leave, threaten to commit suicide, or report the survivor to welfare, or even to child services if there are children involved. They'll use coercive and threatening tactics to have the survivor drop charges, or even have them engage in illegal things. Things like maybe if they're a drug dealer, having them participate in that under threat and coercion. The other two pieces that you won't see in the power and control circle is the cultural abuse and ritual abuse. And this is very much a reality within our tribal communities. Folks may utilize Indianness or using blood quantum to justify why they feel like they have more power in a situation. They misinterpret cultural norms to prove male superiority, or saying that there is female submission within their culture. They'll also have relatives intimidate or threaten the survivor, or even utilize or weaponize blood quantum as a competitive way of saying that they're not valid, that their identity is not valid. We also think about ritual abuse. This may be someone who might engage in bad ways of ceremony where they say they will pray against them. They will also try to justify that spirituality itself is more masculine. Or many of our survivors in tribal communities utilize ceremony and prayer as a means to sustain their spirit, to sustain ways of dealing with what's happening to them. And this relates to also the isolation piece of the triangle, where they may keep her from going to ceremony. They may keep a relative from practicing ways that continue to keep their spirit. So abuse is not only physical and mental and emotional, it's also spiritual. For folks who might use Western faiths like Christianity or Catholicism, they may use religion as a threat. They may utilize pieces of the Bible saying, you know, God does not believe in divorce, or utilizing a woman's menstruation to shame her. So those are two pieces that I would ensure that we understand, especially in tribal communities. Other types of abuse that we should also recognize is neglect. Someone may purposefully neglect a partner or a household member who may depend on the abuser for physical assistance. This could be getting in and around the home. This might be someone who is mentally disabled, maybe someone who's nonverbal, or even children who may have a disability, and even our elders that need help being transported to health appointments, or not letting caregivers come into the home. And this is one area that really hasn't been highlighted, but they are also forms of abuse. Thanks, Tatiana. Another piece of that is a digital abuse, where folks may utilize electronics to control or bully victims. This is checking their phones, checking their social media, posting harassing information, or sharing intimate communication. This is also considered, especially if intimate pictures or intimate texting is involved, is a law. They call it revenge porn. So abusers may disseminate a person's intimate pictures that they may have had trust for them at one time and blast it out to their text through text messaging or posting it on social media. And that is considered a crime, but that's also a form of continuing to inflict abuse on a survivor. We also want to acknowledge that stalking is very much a piece of the abuse. And stalking it's a pattern of behavior, and they're just different individual acts that by themselves might seem harmless or non-criminal. But we need to recognize that it's a course of conduct that's directed at a specific person that would cause them to have reasonable fear, to feel fear. And then when taken into the context of a stalking situation, and I think this takes a lot of documentation on the survivor's part, which is a lot to do, can constitute into a criminal act. So at times, stalking can be a gray area. If you attend our 40-hour training, David Adams does a great segment of the gray areas of stalking and how that case can be labeled as criminal, and how to help advocates recognize those patterns. So we won't get into that today, but I would highly recommend exploring this area a little bit deeper so that you're able to really understand what these patterns look like when a person causing harm are utilizing these tactics that we might see as not harmful. On the other side of the wheel, and I think this is really important, especially those who are working in batter intervention, is when we're taking a holistic approach to what does nonviolence look like towards relatives who are experiencing the violence. We recognize that we want to make sure we're recreating peaceful, harmonious communities based off of our traditional values and belief systems. If you look within this wheel, the outside ring is nonviolence, and that's holding everything within that circle. And these have these key values that we see in there, like compassion, respect, generosity, mutual sharing, humility, contributing, courage, love, and being spiritually centered. And at the center of this tool we see is equality. And this is recognizing that everyone has a right to follow their path, meaning that equality is power sharing. It's not holding power over another person. So equality is at the center of what we know as healthy relationships. The most dangerous time for a survivor in a domestic violence and intimate partner situation is when they decide to leave. This is when the abuser recognizes that they no longer have power and control over a survivor and will act, and their violence can intensify, where they may utilize physical abuse that can lead up to homicide. The the National Institute of Justice in a 2000 study found that in interviews with men who murdered their wives, said that the threat of separation by their partner or the actual separation was what precipitated those events that led to the murder of their partner. So one thing to think about, especially when folks are like, why doesn't she just leave? That's such a huge misconception that, and a stigma that we definitely need to eradicate, because this is the most dangerous time for a survivor. This is where safety planning is needed, where our advocates can sit with survivors and find ways that they can exit the situation in a safe manner. This is more for our advocate training, but I just want to reemphasize that the stigma of survivors that cannot or decide not to leave an abusive situation is just to encourage safety planning. And that's key. What we also need to recognize is the issue of gun violence. Violence against Native women increased significantly when guns were one of the main forms of weapons. Among all other women in the US, Native women are the second most likely to die from homicide of any kind. And this is the direct correlation of domestic violence and intimate partner violence as it relates to the missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives crisis that we recognize today. What I think is important to name as well, and talking with relatives that work with MMIW families or work in MMIW advocacy, is we recognize a lot of the harm that is happening towards our women, our girls, and our non-binary relatives, is the fact that it's happening at the hands of our Native men, of our Native relatives. And I know it's really hard for us to recognize that, but it's something that we need to name if we're going to address this issue altogether. Nationally, the likelihood of a woman being murdered increases by 500% when their partner owns a gun. For Native women, this threat poses is more severe in that over a third, or approximately 35% of homicides against Native women involved a gun. And here are some statistics, things that took place during the pandemic. These are national statistics, but they're also very helpful. I'm not going to go over this piece, so I will, you'll have it in your slides. So as we shift into the overall spirit of this training, thinking about batter intervention, folks causing harm, specifically our male relatives that cause this, I wanted to share this this quote because I feel like it really embodies how we are addressing offender accountability, how we're addressing the persons who are causing harm, that it comes from someplace, right? And we talked a little bit about patriarchy and how that system was set up in a way that perpetuates these westernized knowing of men holding power. What we also need to recognize that our men are also oppressed by patriarchy. Our men are also victims of patriarchy. So I wanted to read this quote. The first act of violence that patriarchy demands of males is not violence towards women. Instead, patriarchy demands of all males that they engage in acts of psychic self-mutilation, that they kill off the emotional parts of themselves. And I just love Bell Hooks because she certainly challenged my thinking of what it means to dismantle patriarchy. How do we get rid of this system that has been harming women, but also how are we engaging in understanding of how the system is also harming our men and boys, socializing them in a very violent way where they're not able to show up as their full selves. they're not able to express themselves as freely or be the wonderful emotional people that they can be in a very healthy way. As we talked before, patriarchy pushes the idea that men have to be hard, that men have to engage in these toxic masculine behaviors that that project violence, onto our women, non-binary and trans relatives, but also how are we supporting that healing, and what restorative practices are we taking to dismantle this structure so that that piece, that part of the violence that comes from patriarchy ends. So segueing into the next piece of our training, the purpose of this training today is that we want to center survivors. We understand that the restorative pieces, the healing pieces is really important, but we want to make sure that the center of the conversations we're having is the overall safety of our survivors, the safety of our communities, the safety of our relatives overall. And that's why we're talking about this today. Secondly, we want to recognize that our men and boys are not disposable. They are not folks that have to be criminalized, but what are some of those restorative ways that can help engage in their healing? We also believe in restorative practices for accountability and healing. What does that look like? This is also an opportunity to foster conversations on community accountability. Things like, how do we get, persons who cause harm, how do we reintegrate them back into community as they start to heal and become whole again? How do we bring them back in a good way? But also, how are they being accountable to their behavior and accountable to restoring that balance and that harmony? This conversation and training also is going to look at how do we indigenize ways of how we heal persons who cause harm. We understand that we're not responsible for their healing, but as good relatives, we are responsible for creating those spaces for the opportunity of healing. We are responsible for creating supportive structures and supportive ways for folks that don't want to engage in violent behaviors anymore. What's our responsibility to ensuring that that space is there for our relatives? And that space generally starts within our batter intervention programs, but also even in our homes and within our communities. So I wanted to put that out there as well. So as we segue into this next break, just something to reflect on. And you can drop this into the chat if you'd like, or if you feel called to take yourself off mute, please do so. But why is it important for us to change how we approach batter intervention? And I think with that, we can go into our break time. Thank you, everyone. I know that was a lot of information in about an hour, but I really appreciate you. If you have any questions, please drop it into the chat. I will be on for the break as well if you want to ask questions there, but I think we can go ahead and go into our break right now. We will go ahead and get into our next area of presentation. I want to introduce Mr. Clifford Jack. He will be presenting on the attitudes, beliefs, and values, behavior regarding domestic violence, the socialization of boys and men, toxic masculinity strategies to effectively work with Native offenders. So with that, Mr. Jack, I will pass it to you.
It's been a while. I've been on Zoom, presenting on Zoom. During the pandemic, I did my groups on Zoom, and it was very challenging. And as soon as the pandemic kind of died down, we started our groups live back in July of 2021. So I'm a little rusty in this area right now. And I didn't know I was ready to go on. I was back there making phone calls. just a little thing about the Zoom during the pandemic. Very challenging. I did substance abuse outpatient groups and also an intensive outpatient group. And it was like herding cats. One of the requirements for our participants was to have their radios on. And so it was always a challenge, like some of them would be halfway hidden and some of them would be just their forehead showing. And sometimes children ran in, sometimes they were busy cooking. So it was a big challenge. Anyway, I'm glad that I'm here. And I have a PowerPoint. My name is Clifford Jack. Schneidel, Hawasana Bashishin for the Chini, or Hawasana Dashiche for the Chini Dashinari. I had to think about that. I work with a place called Commonwealth Clinical Services. Like I said, I do substance abuse education and also counseling. I've been there for quite a while. Before that, I was a offender facilitator with a shelter, domestic violence shelter. And I just want to say before I go on that everything that I'm going to share with y'all was a learning experience as I did the work. And I also want to acknowledge the people who I learned from. And those were mainly from my own male or female relatives, my female coworkers, and the experiences from the female survivors that I advocated for. Those were the people I learned a lot from, and all my knowledge that I'm sharing today comes from them. Okay. So let me. I'm going to minimize myself so I'm not watching myself. Oops, I went the wrong way. And on the agenda, attitudes, beliefs, values, behaviors regarding domestic violence, socialization of men, boys, toxic masculinity strategies to effectively work with Native offenders is what I was tasked to do. I was gonna read, or not read, but tell you all a story about a friend of mine who is going through some abuse. And a lot of the stuff that I was gonna talk about, Jolene touched up on the unnatural power and control, and then her husband is using everything that Jolene talked about. And the thing that really surprised me was the fact that the courts told her that she's not able to utilize the evidence that she collected from the text messages and the recorded voicemails that this person was leaving for her. And I've listened to some of the stuff that he's saying, and it is very disturbing. And I told her that she's in a very dangerous position right now. So I haven't heard from her in a while. And my question was, where did these come from? The male toxicity, the attitudes, the values, the behaviors and beliefs from this person that's utilizing all these tactics against his wife. And going back to the history, Jolene talked about patriarchy. Patriarchy is the stem of it, and it's I put in the text that it was also a learned behavior. It's from historical trauma, and although I'm not gonna repeat what was said already. Next, I'm gonna talk about this quote right here. Margaret Atwood is a Canadian poet, and she also wrote a novel called Handmaid's Tale. I've never seen the segments or the series. I believe it's on Hulu. And the story goes where the setting is in present day, not present day, but futuristic United States. Some conservative people took over, and they were only using women as vessels to procreate. They lost all of their rights, and I'm not sure how it goes. However, that's the novel that she wrote. This quote is from a lecture that she did in 1982 titled Writing the Male Character. And she does novels. And the transcript from the lecture was this. She asked, "Why do men feel threatened by women?" I asked a male friend of mine. Men are bigger most of the time. They can run faster, strangle better, and they have on the average a lot more money and power. And the friend said, they're afraid women will laugh at them, he said. I asked some women student in a quickie poetry seminar I was given, why do women feel threatened by men? And they answered, they're afraid of being killed. So this quote also made it into a book by Gavin D. Becker in 1997, where he's the one that wrote a book for self-help for people who survive abuse. And it's called The Gift of Fear. And in it, he writes, I don't remember where I first heard the simple description of one dramatic contrast between the genders, but it is strikingly accurate. At core, men are afraid women will laugh at them, while at core, women are afraid men will kill them. So this is the essence of the attitude, values, behaviors, and the beliefs that lead to violence against women, which is also known as male toxicity, the heteropatriarchy, and also the misogynistic beliefs. I just want to share my journey, how I got into this field. In 2005, I got my bachelor's degree in social work, and I'm ready to save the world. I think the word they use in social studies is ameliorate. And I applied for a lot of places, and the only place that I got a return call was from a domestic violence shelter called the Home for Women and Children. I started there, and the director there said, the only position I have available that I would like you to try is the DVOTI, Domestic Violence Offender Treatment Intervention. And at the time, I didn't really know anything about domestic violence, the dynamics. All I knew was the average abuse is physical. I didn't know the other components. So at the time, there was a young lady running the program, and she gave me the book, this book right here, called the Education Group for Men Who Batter, and it was from the Duluth Model. One of the things that I learned while doing the work is I had to really look at my own self, look at my own, what they say in the 12 steps in Alcoholics Anonymous is the wreckage of my past. And dispute those beliefs I had about gender relationships. And I recognized that I did some emotional abuse to my partners, also my female relatives, my sisters, my mom. And one of the things I realized is that it was the belief system that caused me to do all those. So when I did that, I realized that I need to come clean with that and also be able to address the behaviors of other men that I'm meeting with and to dismantle their beliefs on the power and control that they have over their partners. After reading the book, it really challenged me, and one of the things that I concluded after looking at the book cover to cover, reading it, the whole thing, is that I'm supposed to be a biased advocate for the safety of women. During the transition to become that bias safety advocate for the safety of women meant that I need to side with the victims, who are mainly women. I did some of my presentations from the get-go, and based on some of the education that I read on it, I would be challenged by other men. They would throw things at me like, hey, what about those women who batter? What about men that are being battered? What about those people? Women are more violent than men. All these things. So I had to really look into it. I looked at the statistics. Every region has their own statistics on domestic violence, and that's when I realized that every domestic or a relationship that has abuse, about 90% of the time, the man was the batterer. And then I also realized that the language that general society uses to express and talk about violence against women, and a lot of times it was always the women's behavior that was brought into light. Why does she keep going back? Why she must like to be beaten and things like that. And I realized, how come they don't really focus on the men's behaviors? In that transition to become that bias advocate for the safety of women, I also realized that not only women were being battered, being abused, it was also the children. So at the shelter that I was working at, had 9 rooms. Therefore, 9 mothers came in, and average of 3 children. So that's 27 plus 9. My arithmetic is correct. That's how many people, individuals, were at the shelter at any given moment. At the end of the year, you multiply that by the numbers that we had. And I looked at that and I said, wow, I'm also advocating for the safety of children. It was sad to see these little children come in middle of the night with only their shoes on, or without their shoes on, no jacket, sometimes in the winter, summer. And they would get curious about me, and I made a mistake of saying hello, smiling, laughing, kind of interacting with them, and they just came to me like magnets. And the reason was because they were missing their fathers. The victims came in battered, visibly battered. I'm not gonna talk about the details on that, but it was pretty horrific. However, after several days, the children would be asking for their father. And that was a sad thing for me to see. And the other one was, surprised me, was the little boy who was cussing his mother out, using the same words his father uses to emotionally abuse his mother. So all these dynamics I learned. And with the men, meeting with them, I started using their children as their soft spot. because I know no man wakes up in the morning and says, I'm going to be a bad father. They just learn to be bad people with their behaviors. If there's any things that you'd like to ask, let me know. I'm just reading the chat here. I'm going to be all over the place. I hope that I give you the info that you're all looking for one. Let me see. My prompting is not working. Okay, here we go. Bias advocate for the safety of women. Battery intervention programs are only as good as the facilitator, and I aim to be the best facilitator. How do I do that was one of my biggest questions. And the quote from Pence and Paymar says, this work begins with commitment. Commitment is, one thing I learned is doing something although sometimes you don't want to do it. There was times when I approached a group and all these men looking at me and I'm like, holy bleep, bleep, bleep. But I still showed up to do the groups. That was commitment. It begins with a commitment to women who are called names, beaten, kicked, pushed, stabbed, held hostage, raped, and subjected to constant attack on their very essence as a human being. One of the other things also was that domestic violence is a learned behavior, and I used to say it's a learned behavior, therefore y'all can unlearn it, but that wasn't true. I started telling them that they can do things differently. In the Duluth model, the other thing that I learned about being a good facilitator was to not collude. Collusion. Collusion is really easy to do. My first assessment, the guy came in, sat down in front of me. Oh, my wife is doing this, doing that. And he made himself the victim. The challenging thing, little self-disclosure here, the most challenging thing at the time when I started was I was also going through a divorce in my marriage. And everything he was saying was something similar to what I experienced, but I had to stay quiet and could not collude with him. That was his story and mine was my own. I had to check myself. I can't collude. The other way collusion happens is a lot of times in group members, men might make a joke. I remember one guy came out with the hurricane joke. Why do they give hurricane female names? Some of you probably heard it. I'm not gonna reiterate it. The group laughed and I'm just standing there with a stern face and looking at him like, that's not a cool joke. The way I approached it was back on my background in the military is to really be stern, really structure it. But today I'm thinking about it after I've done a lot of substance abuse groups, our clientele, they're afraid of groups. They're going through situations that I probably don't know about. So one of the things that we do is meet the client where they're at. I used to think like, what does that mean? But some people have no vehicles. I do, so I need to remember how it was not when I didn't have a vehicle. So my approach to better facilitation probably would be different today than how it was when I first started. And I really set up strict rules on certain things, and they shouldn't. And that's probably one of the things I would continue is for them not to talk about their partner's behaviors, but really look at themselves and check their behaviors. There's a male privilege that I learned about also. There was objectification that I learned about. And from the Duluth Model, the power and control wheel. The power and control wheel was began in the late 70s, late or early 80s. At the time, in 1977, an incident happened that caught national attention where the victim set her husband on fire while he was passed out on a mattress, and it made a movie also, Farrah Fawcett, The Burning Bed. And she was, I believe, not convicted, but recently I wrote a term paper about her as an introduction. So there was 1977 also was the first time national television coined the term batterer. Before that, nobody ever talked about women being battered or being abused. And things were changing a little bit. 1977, around that same time, the place where I worked at, the Home for Women and Children, was being built. I remember I used to ride the bicycle through there to the post office, and there was a machine where they made the bricks out of sand. And they built this building, and that's where the shelter began. The power and control wheel, Jolene talked about it a little. Ellen Pence and her coworkers, they developed that. In her introduction on the book, it states that they interviewed about 6,000 women. 6,000 stories were collected, and they identified all the tactics their batterers used against them. And they had a list. They had a list of physical abuse, emotional abuse, financial abuse. One of the things they really didn't do was the spiritual abuse. There was also sexual abuse. And they also concluded that if there's physical abuse, there's also going to be sexual abuse. And the creators said, okay, have a whole list, another whole list of things. How are we going to make people aware that these things are going on? So like an advertisement, logos, they chose the wheel, and they also condensed the list. Some tactics were similar, so they said, let's eliminate this, let's put that one here. So that's where the original power and control wheel was formulated. Power and control wheel is in the middle, the words, and that's the essence of abuse. And on the outer rung is the physical violence along with the sexual violence. And
Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
I don't know if you changed your slide, but it's still on the collusion side.
Yes.
Oh, okay. And you had one question in the chat from Michelle. Mr. Jack, how do you use the children to get fathers to look at their abusive behaviors?
I use the learned behavior. If children are watching, they're gonna emulate those very behaviors. They're going to learn that disrespecting mom is okay, just like the thing that I said about the little boy calling his mom the same words his dad used against her. And like I said, I would kind of acknowledge them being a father. And I would also say to them that nobody ever says, I want to be a bad father, but still these abuses are happening. So that's what I would go to them, use that for them to see that their abuse is also affecting others, not just their partners. Does that answer the question?
I believe so. Let us know, Michelle, if that's good. She says yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. So the power and control wheel. And the reason why I didn't put the power and control wheel up here was because you had the hierarchy, and I don't want to put it up here. I just wanted to really elaborate on how it was created. Like I said, it was out of 6,000 interviews, and they condensed it down to a circle. And the batterer's behavior are all the same. They use the same words, they use the same tactics. And when I was working at the shelter, I remember I would talk to some of the people living there, and their stories were similar. And from the beginning, I would think, like, are they in a relationship with the same man? And their behaviors are all similar, all different people experiencing the same types of abuse. And that's how they came up with that power and control wheel. And from the beginning, when they were getting the data together, Ellen Penn said men desired power and control over their female partners. But by the time they were done, they realized that their first conclusion was not correct. And their conclusion next was that men felt entitled to have power and control over their female partners. So there's a difference, desire and feeling entitled. Feeling entitled is that I already have this, so therefore that should be the way things are. Okay, toxic masculinity. We have this picture of a young boy trapped behind wire. One of the ways I explain toxic masculinity is a box. You see the words up there, the phrases that this young man, little boy probably has endured already. Men don't cry. Don't be I'm not going to read that word, man up. Stop being such a girl. Be a man. Don't be a wimp. Toxic masculinity is a term often used to describe the negative aspects of exaggerated masculine traits. One of the biggest trait to be masculine is to be tough. You have to be tough. You can't cry. You can't show any kind of emotion. Otherwise, you're placed in this box where just imagine this little boy being in a box. I call it the non-masculine box. I used to call it the word box. And my own experience as a kid, I remember my cousin was Vietnam veteran, just came back overseas, and he said to me one day, you need to learn how to box. This is how you do it. So he showed me, he's this giant looming guy, and I'm just a little person. And at one time, I remember he held up his flip-flops, and I'm going at it with my little fist, just knocking the heck out of it. And he goes, come on, do it harder, harder. If you don't know how to learn to fight, you're going to be crying with a bloody nose. I always remember that. So when I got into school, my first thing was to dominate the playground. And I would use my violence, my skills, my fighting skills to overcome my fear of these other young boys that were out there. And as I grew up, my friends, sometimes they would dare me to do things like, come on, don't be all those things right there. So I ended up doing a lot of crazy, dangerous things. And that's how it was throughout the rest of my life. I stayed out of that masculinity box, so I won't be called that. One of the things the Jackson Cats talked about was the biggest crusher of men or males was being compared to a female, being compared to a girl. I remember running the relay in the Shiprock Marathon. I'm always to my my destination, like, I don't know, it's just right up there. I'm huffing and puffing. I'm tired. I did 5 miles. We did 5-mile segments with a team of 6, I believe it was, and that was the whole 26 miles. And there's people along the way handing out water, encouraging people, and the guy was like, come on, don't let that girl outrun you. I didn't care if she outran me. I just wanted to make it to that other place. And that's how toxic masculinity is. Bravado. And the work that I do today, I think there's some questions. Let me check. Have you had any men not want to look at their behavior, and how did you work with them to address their behaviors? About a majority of them did not want to work on their behaviors because of the way they were raised. And some of them I knew they faked it by saying, oh, I'm a better person. And a lot of times it was really showing the behaviors, how the violence affected others, and ask them specifically. One question was, how would you feel if female relative was being treated in that manner? If they didn't like it, I would say, then why are you engaged in those same behaviors, these same abusive behaviors? And a lot of times, some of the men did not want to change because they benefited from it. And also, it was meshed with the toxic masculinity. Their relatives would do it. They're doing it. They were actually encouraged. And I've seen in the general observation of people, men do that. Show her who wears the pants in the house. And all those same words that stay out of that non-masculinity box, men say to others in our relationship. They encourage it. And the next question is, I'm curious, have you had women in group? I see LGBTQ couples going through DB. Yes, I did women's group. A lot of times, women who were in the court order to do domestic violence groups, classes, were actually victims / survivors themselves. And just that moment that they come to protect themselves with violence, they got arrested. I remember one young lady, she was in my group. She stabbed her husband either with a butter knife or a fork. I don't remember what it was. in the back because he was attacking her, and she ended up doing the groups. And yes, the LGBTQ couples, there were some, not as a couple, but as individuals. Their dynamics are different from heterosexual abusive relationships. One of the funny thing, I don't know if it's funny, but it was funny at the moment. I was doing my presentation to the group at my current work, and one guy says, I was telling them that men were a lot of times the aggressor, the batterer, 80% of the time based on statistics. He says, well, women are abusive too in LGBTQ couples. I looked at him, I wanted to say something very sarcastic, like, duh. Anyway, yes, did that answer your question? All righty. Thanks for your questions. A lot of this toxic masculinity is talked about by a man called Jackson Katz. Jackson Katz he does seminars, he trains police officers, a lot of advocates, and talks about this masculinity, how it's become toxic, where it comes from. A lot of them has to do with what I just talked about. Men grew up in it. And sometimes even female relatives call the young boys those names. I remember I was in a relationship before, and there was a little boy and two girls in that relationship I had. So then my stepchildren, and I remember the two little girls, they used to call the little boy those names. Quit crying. So I had to sit them down and say, hey, that's not a cool thing to do. I don't know if they're still doing it. And I think that young man is probably 17 now. He was probably 3 or 4 at the time. Anyway, Jackson Katz, if you all want to look at his stuff, it's on YouTube. There's Tough Guys is 1 and 2. The number one, the first one he made is on YouTube. It's a little bit outdated. However, he did Tough Guys 2. It used to be on YouTube, but they took it back down, and you have to rent it. I don't know where. Jackson Katz. I like his last name. And bravado. I was talking about bravado in my groups. Men come in. I don't have a problem, and I'm talking about substance abuse right now. Kind of a little bit off the topic. However, it does mesh with domestic violence and these behaviors that they have, beliefs that they have about substance use and also abuse. Bravado, they come in like, I don't have any emotions. I don't feel nothing. I don't need to be here. And in my groups, I usually start off with their emotions. I would say, what emotions are you feeling? And they try to say, I'm good, I'm okay, I'm all right. But then I would say, hey, no, you can't use those words. What about real emotions? Some people are like, oh, okay, I'm just feeling sad, things like that. So I challenge them, like, if you want to use the word good, I want you to sing it like what was that guy's name? I Feel Good guy. I don't remember his name. Somebody James. Only one guy did it.
Brown was the last name, right?
James Brown, that's right. I feel good. Yeah, only one guy did it. It was funny. When I first started asking my participants on the emotions they were feeling, I was a little bit hesitant, like how is it going to be received? And I just went ahead with it. And towards several weeks later, there was a young man who was finishing the group, and I asked him what was one of the things that he learned and got out of this substance abuse group that he attended. And what he said was, this was the only place where I was asked how I was feeling, what emotions I was feeling. And I thought, wow, that's a good tool. And as men, we don't ask each other about feelings also. And we just be James Brown and say, I feel good. And how do we address our emotions? Sometimes our emotions we utilize it through, or we express it through anger, aggression, violence. And anger is usually a secondary emotion. People who are hurt, who are humiliated, feeling fear, some kind of fear, they resort to anger. Anger is not part of the reasons the abuse happens. It's about power and control. Anger is used as a tool to express or to use as an excuse to batter. Sometimes I would ask the guys why they got mad at their partners because of this, because of that. And sometimes I would say, do you ever get angry at your coworkers? Somebody ever piss you off at coworkers? They would say, yeah. How come you didn't beat them? How come you didn't beat up your boss? So they know that they're able to control their anger. They're able to control their abuse. Any questions on this toxic masculinity? One of the other things about toxic masculinity is rigid gender roles. Do you think that emotions they hold in stems from their own childhood? I know in my work, men have been abused by women, their own mothers, sisters, and aunts. Yes, yes, and yes, and yes. A lot of the batterers that I know that have been negative responses from their female relatives. So they become, what do you call that, masogenic views. They don't respect women. They don't care for women's emotions. I see that a lot. However, some men who come from single mothers who love them dearly can also learn these behaviors of being abusive. And that question right there is basically what I'm talking about right here with the toxic masculinity, to stay out of that non-masculinity box. Did I answer the question? Okay. The strict gender roles, men work, women belong here, there, somewhere in their beliefs. Okay, objectification. Jackson Katz talks about a lot about this, and so does another lady, Jean Kilbourne. I'm going to show her name later. Objectification is basically turning a living thing into an object. And when you turn a thing into an object, it's easy to use violence or aggression against them. Animals, we objectify them every day. Well, I asked my audience that one time, like, how do we objectify animals? And one lady in the audience says, oh, we dress them up. But no, that wasn't the answer. Live audiences, I kind of have fun with this question. Since we're all in a box, I'm not gonna ask. We objectify animals by turning them into food products. We don't go into a restaurant and say, I want to order a sliced pig. We say bacon or ham. We don't go to McDonald's and say a quarter pounder cow. We say hamburgers. So those are ways animals are objectified, because eating a whole animal does not look good. Not appealing, I don't think. Anyway, the picture right there that I have up is an ad from the I believe the 60s or 70s, and that's the way society generally viewed women in the past. There's a whole mess of advertisements that are oriented in this way, how women are treated as objects, and that's the beginnings of, not beginnings, but part of the perpetuation of violence against women. The other thing that I learned kind of off the topic was listening to these rockabilly music. A lot of them has to do with control over women. The term "she's going to be mine, I'm going to make her mine" are in a lot of songs from the past. They're like possession. And that's all the songs are about. So if you're curious to listen to a lot of the songs from the 50s, 60s, maybe any year, the genres are like that, and of course the some of the hip hops are pretty explicit in that manner. That's where the beliefs come from, the toxic masculinity and the objectifications. People are also objectified. Our government objectifies people. We talked about manifest destiny. Here's a superior race conquering brown-skinned people, and the way they were portrayed was as inhuman or subhuman, whatever it is. So that was easier to wage war on, and also to murder and commit genocide. All that, that's objectification. Our government still does that. Back in the 1980s, when I went into the service, the USSR, Russia, was the main enemy. So we used to have these caricatures of Russian people, Russian troops with the exaggerated nose, AK-47s, and they told us these are the people that are going to kill us. Therefore, we got to fight back and kill them. But they never showed us what the real Russians were, like the potato farmers that live kind of like my own relatives here on the res. So that's objectification of people. And then, of course, there's gender, objectification of women. The example you see right there in the advertisement. The dangers of objectification, like I said, is once you objectify a person, it's easy to do violence on them, to hurt them, to abuse them, call them names, use degrading words. That's a precursor. A man never says, "Hey, honey," and then slaps her. It's usually you, whatever. You can exert any degrading word in there and will abuse his partner. And privilege is part of it. Any questions on the objectification? And we get into male privilege. The first thing that I learned is that I have privilege as a man. And the one thing that the reason I didn't know I have these privileges was because that was my number one privilege, is not knowing I having these privileges. Sounds confusing. So let's just read it. Not knowing that I have male privilege is my number one privilege. I was just born into society, and society treats me a certain way, and I benefit from it. Therefore, I do not see the struggles of the other gender, which I learned in the process doing my work, that I had privilege. So sometimes I would say I'm going to use my male privilege to address violence against women on some of my Facebook platforms. And male privilege, the word privilege is a way society treats a certain group of people. Privilege is sometimes misunderstood. privilege is a verb also. And the verb privilege is the one where we got sanctioned sometimes as a child. We got into trouble, things were taken away as a punishment. Our privileges were taken away. Right now we have driving privileges. However, the noun privilege, the person, place, or thing privilege is what that is. It's a thing. It's the way society treats a certain group of people. It can be status, it could be race, and it could be gender. And we're focusing on gender right now. As a man, I'm less likely to be a target of street harassment. I've never been whistled at. I've never been told that I have a nice part of my body, whatever, anything. I've never felt unsafe on the street unless it's well, and generally sometimes I do, but it's not where I'm going to be like, okay, that man looks like he's going to sexually assault me. I don't have to think that. When I go shopping, I don't have to park under the light. I can go into the store anytime I want to. I don't have to get one of my male friends and say, hey, bro, let's go shopping because I feel unsafe. That's never going to happen because of my male privilege. I'm less likely to be stalked, and I'm less likely to experience any partner violence. And I'm most likely not going to be a victim of revenge porn. And going back to that one, you're less likely to be raped. I did an experiment that Jackson Katz talked about on his documentary. I asked my male audience if they ever, what are some of the things they do so they won't get raped? And it's usually a general laughter, ha ha ha. And one of the other answers would be like stay out of prison. And then if there was a mixture of women and men, I would ask them to list ways that they keep themselves safe. And women would actually have a list go on, men didn't. And that was part of the male privilege. And the last one says you're less likely to be homeless as a result of intimate partner violence. And this is just a small segment of privilege. There's a whole list, 160 examples of male privilege. Before I started wearing my Dickies, that was a step up from what I used to wear. It was just a t-shirt. I used to do my groups, t-shirt, jeans, and a pair of work boots. I was telling my audience that about male privilege, and I said, I have the privilege because I come to work like dressed like this, t-shirt, jeans, and work boots, and nobody says nothing about it. And there was a guy sitting in the back, he's laughing, he had a smirk on his face. And I called him out, and I was like, hey, so what's funny? He says, you know what? The last week, well, I don't remember what he said, but there was your female coworker was dressed the same way, and I was thinking that she should dress more professional. And that's part of it, the double standards. A lot of male privilege. Nobody says it. Nobody bats an eye on our or my behaviors. However, if it's a woman that does it, people lose their stuff over it. That's part of male privilege. And I sometimes I get challenged by somebody says, what about female privilege? Explain that to me, and they don't have an answer. But there's no such thing. That makes sense? I forget I'm not in my group. I use that term a lot. Does that make sense? So where do we go from here, or where do we start? I thought of the Guns N' Roses song. Where do we go? Where do we start? How do we begin addressing men's behavior? How do we change? How do we make these changes? And when am I done? So where do we start? How did I start? Changing my own, looking at my own behaviors and identifying that I need to be advocating for the safety of women, which was kind of like an easy transition because of the way I grew up. I grew up with my mother and two sisters. My mother never had a male partner, and she always talked about the abuse that her sister experienced, and she also talked about her own sexual assault at the age of 12 by two oil field workers. And there's one of the things that I realized after my mom passed was that she told me her life story segments at a time and through her behaviors. And right before my mom passed, 3 months before that, I lost my son. And I was thinking like, wow, my mom never taught me how to grieve over the loss of a child. But throughout my life, my mom showed me how she dealt with her grieving process, with the loss of her parents, the loss of her sister, and the loss of her innocence as a child. And that was probably one of the things that really made me look at men's behavior, especially the violence they perpetrated on their female partners. The quote says, we encourage each man and woman who takes on the task of facilitating groups for men who batter to walk in the room, mindful of the women whose lives have been diminished by the violence of those you seek to help. The group was encircled by those women. What jokes, what conversations, what expectations, and what explanations would seem appropriate? One of the other thing that I learned is that it's going to take men to step up and to become allies and really demonstrate the abuse, not demonstrate abuse, but call out the men who batter about their behaviors. Right now, I read things, I observe people in my groups, how men talk about their partners. It's a perpetuation, going in circles over and over and over based on these beliefs. So it has to take men to dismantle their own beliefs and also to call out their bros, their fathers, their brothers, their homies, whoever, and start focusing on the behaviors. One thing that the other thing that I noticed was sometimes I would have female presenters, or I would sit in with female presenters, and the men's attitude are different. They either try to do their charming thing or their toxic masculinity. And they would try to outsmart the presenter by questions that they feel like is gonna stump the presenter. Sometimes when I take leave, somebody takes over. It's a young lady, and when I ask her, like, this guy was asking or acting this way, he did this, he said that, and I was like, wow. When I'm there, they're totally different. So that's part of that male privilege, and it's gonna take men to really make these changes. And it's also difficult to find men who are willing to step up and say, get rid of this armor and say, I really need to help women. I really need to become a biased advocate for the safety of women. There are some out there, and I've met some and I work with some. So here's the question: Duluth or not to Duluth? I chose to utilize the Duluth model when I first started. It was very mind-changing for me. I learned a lot, especially from the power and control wheel and the history behind it. And also the book says that the men have the capacity to change, and that was where I used their children and showed some kind of compassion and empathy for them, and their abuse was hurting their whole family, not just the partner. The last one is it includes community-wide coordination, and there was a lot of walls here, law enforcement, court judges, prosecutors, probation, shelters. Breaking down the beliefs was one of the biggest challenge with the community because of the mindset goes against what the advocates were doing. And of course, there's the victim blaming. One of the things about the victim blaming is that my culture, Navajo culture, every time a woman runs for any kind of leadership, they always bring up something from the past and say, if a woman gets to become a leader, the world's gonna end. And they always use that at any capacity. So it's gonna take a lot. On top of that, that's a traditional belief. On top of that is the religious side. And I'm not gonna really elaborate on that and leave it where it's at. The Duluth Model says, has the dynamics of abuse and can be tweaked with cultural relevance. So I utilize a lot of the teachings, and historical trauma, manifest destiny, boarding schools, the Treaty of 1868. Treaty of 1868 is where the government ignored the women leaders while they were in prison at Fort Sumner. And that's why when you look at the Treaty of 1868, there's all male signatures or X marks on there. Women were excluded out of these decision making. However, before that, women were leaders. There's also the emerged curriculum that I utilize. I don't remember. It's been a while since I did the DVOTI. And that's how I approached it. One of the other things that I did was to talk about clans, matrilineal clans. We're all matriarchs. We all come from our female relatives. And when I say my clan, I am representing all the women, all the mothers in the generations before. And that's who I state. There was a question about how come we don't say our, what was it? We don't say our father's clan first. And I would break it down on a diagram because you're representing your mom, and then you represent your grandfather, maternal and paternal. I would use that, and then I would tell them. My mother used to say, "Be knowledgeable in your clan system. Always acknowledge other people's clans, and if you do, you're never going to be without a relative." In Navajo, it would be where you go, you're going to run into a relative. And nowadays, with the rape culture, it's a tool that people use to see if they're able to date a new person they met, which I disagree with. Okay, challenges when I was doing the BIP on Navajo Nation, there's always the lack of it, was the money. There's always that lack, and little or no support from the government. I did a sexual harassment training with the council members of Navajo Nation, and there was a lot of resistance. I remember that. And of course, there's not enough committed BIP facilitators, not a lot of men able to take on that role to call out other men. Mandated curriculums are too adversarial, meaning it's very punitive, very confrontational. And when I learned that when I do that, people shut down, people become defensive, guarded. So and like I mentioned earlier, my approach would be different today if I were to do BIP again. Granters want linear measurement of progress. Okay, that this person entered into a group, has he stopped battering his partner? What are the changes that he's made? We really don't know. With the substance abuse, at least we know that they're staying sober through urinalysis, or their participation in community resources such as Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous. So we can measure those. However, with the BIP, it was difficult. Anybody can say that they're good. They're not doing anything. And we only know 10% of their behaviors, and the rest of it is hidden. Limited or no tribal codes addressing violence against women. Navajo Nation is limited. I know when I was working, it took about more than 10 years to change the wording on the codes to address violence against women. Not everything is a challenge. So at the end of the book on the Duluth, there's a segment where the writers say, throughout the pages are the voices of men. And the short segments we use in the text of this book illustrate specific points, but leave the spirit of the groups back in the classrooms. They don't show the times humorous things happened, the times the group lost focus and went nowhere, the times the men really helped each other out, the times the men were vulnerable, or the times the men are leaving talk about typo there, I think, talk about their experience and say goodbye. I think it's when they are leaving and talk about their experience and say goodbye. Yes, I can relate to this. Sometimes we go off topic and talk about other things just to humanize these batterers and also to build rapport with them. But I still remain strict on the jokes that they told, what they said, the phrases they used. I was watching, last Sunday, I was watching a movie, and it's called Arthur and Merlin. King Arthur, and I believe he was a wizard. And in the movie, there was a regime before, I might be misinterpreting it, but they had to get rid of the evil guy, and they did. And there's young King Arthur was going to be ready to take on the kingdom. The old king, I think he died or something, I don't remember. And so the mantle, the kingdom was passed on to King Arthur. And he looked at Merlin. Merlin said, or he looked at Merlin and he said, "But I'm not ready." And Merlin looked at him and said, "We are never ready." So that's my conclusion, is that we are never ready. But with support, reaching out, learning, we can jump into certain things, challenges, and make a difference. And that was probably one of the things I did. I wasn't ready to take on the BIP back in 2005, but I learned, I changed my ways, I looked at myself, and I made a difference. And the difference might not been like, hey, you've changed 100 people's lives. I never heard that, anything. I still never hear being thanked for changing lives, but it's okay. I know that somebody took one thing out of it and maybe changed their life, or maybe they took everything and changed their whole future. And this is the where I got all my stuff, the Duluth Model. Jean Kilbourne, Killing It Softly, she talks about how advertisement objectifies women. And she started back in the 60s, and this documentary is her fourth one. She uses a lot of her experience as a model, how society portrays women, how advertisement depicts women to be sex objects, and et cetera, that objectification. So I believe it's available on YouTube. And then the other one is Jackson Katz, Tough Guys, the one I was talking about, Violence, Manhood, and American Culture. A lot of my information, my own learning experience come from there also. And of course, everything I do is in memory of my mother. Thank you.
So now for the next 15 minutes, we'll have a Q&A session. So if anybody has more questions, ponderings, I think this is our time before lunchtime to kind of just chat and share our thoughts, questions, reflections. And this would be specific for the last two presentations for this morning session. So Cliff's and Jolene's, if anybody has any thoughts or questions or both. I wonder, Cliff, if you had answered the question earlier from Michelle, do you think that the emotions that they hold in stems from their own childhood? I know in my work, men have been abused by women, their own mothers, sisters, aunts, etc. I don't know if we touched on that one yet.
Yes, I did.
Okay, great. Let's see some comments here from Victoria. I am so appreciative of all of this knowledge. Thank you so much. And then Taryn was saying, thank you, both Jolene and Mr. Jack, for sharing your wisdom. And we have a question. What age group of men do you think are the most receptive to your trainings? From Marquita Adakai.
Young men, they're still really teachable. One guy, I remember, he was older than me. When he was leaving, he said to me, like, I would probably believe in all this stuff that you told me if it came from somebody older than me. And the older people were less receptive to my information, and a lot of them had come from the boarding school era, and that was the challenge. So it was usually the younger men that were really receptive to this information. And also they had young kids, like little infants, children under 5, 10 years old. So they were willing to make some of these changes.
And if I may, I also like to kind of answer that question, as well as the one about, how some of those issues can also stem from abuse from maybe like a woman, their own mother, sister, or aunts. And Mr. Jack is right, definitely. It really stems in the early childhood and development phases. It's a learned behavior, as Mr. Jack said. And what's also learned, I think, if we're connecting this back to patriarchy, is when we talk about women who cause harm, maybe our femme-identifying relatives who cause harm, a lot of that comes from internalized misogyny, right? Internalized sexism, where at times maybe we have female relatives that also inflict violence, but also kind of perpetuate or even enable some of our male relatives into the behaviors that they have. And a lot of it becomes from those types of violences that stem from patriarchy, which are internalized. So for instance, how many of you are familiar with the term Sunny Boy? Just an emoji, if you want to give an emoji. or drop it in the chat. Are we familiar with the term sunny boy? Right? Okay. So we know that term is a means of endearment, right? We want our young men and our boys to be protected. We want our young men and boys to show up as their full selves and be very successful in life. And I want to illustrate just from my own experience, but also ways of unlearning within my own family that's taking place, is especially as Indigenous women, we have this kind of like double standard, right? Where our in my family, we'll use my family as an example. I don't want to point out anyone. Where my brothers had the capabilities to move about freely, they could hang out with their friends, they could do whatever it was that they wanted because they were boys. On the other end, me as a woman, as a girl back then, I was much more restricted, but also I was told that you take care of your brother, you take care of your dad. You make sure you cook for them, you make sure you do this for them, but also you can't do this, you can't go here, you can't engage in like these fun activities that I wanted to be a part of. So there was like that double standard, right? That indoctrination at a young age of who we were, or who we are supposed to be. And a part of that stems from patriarchal teachings. And I want to connect this back to boarding schools because that's where it comes from, right? A lot of our parents are products of boarding schools where our men were taught industrious ways of labor, being the head of the household, controlling finances. And then you had young women who were taught to sew, to cook, to take home economics, how to be a good wife, a good mother. And that kind of trickled down and seeped into our communities, which indoctrinated both our men and our women into these defined roles. So when you look at it today, where our young sunny boys who engage in these violent behaviors, or picking on their sisters, or picking on girls, or engaging in criminal behaviors, that they're given more leniency. Whereas if it were a young Indigenous woman, a Navajo woman like me, if I were to engage in something similar, I would get the wrath of my parents. Whereas my brothers didn't experience that. It was, oh, they're boys, it's different. They're young men, it's different. So when we talk about how our mothers and our aunties have this internalized misogyny and patriarchy, it can come out in projecting it onto their daughters. It took a lot of unlearning for my own mother to recognize that some of the harsh words she would say to us, whereas she would, not say it to my brothers, it was like this double standard that was happening. And all that to say is that our aunties, our mothers, our sisters have also this internalizing that violence, and it's projected in a way that can come out as abuse or come out as violence. So just making that connection, that we recognize that this comes from this system that was set in place, right, historically, that we're trying to unlearn, that we're trying to decolonize. So when we think about reconnecting our roles in a more indigenized sense, especially our relatives that come from a tribal nation, reflect on how that looked like in your society back then, right? For me as a Diné woman, Mr. Jack explained how the Treaty of 1868 was not signed until the women agreed to it. Amazing historian, Dr. Jennifer Dennett-Dale, she's a professor at UNM, did some digging in history and found journals from the military at that time that indicated, and it was odd to them, that these men would go back to the women for some of these bigger decision-making pieces that were happening. So the role of women and our role of our men, our Naglehe, our trans relatives, our non-binary relatives, there was a lateral equity among that within our society. There were also ceremonies, specific roles that we had, that we honored, that was very much different from westernized ways of what we know today. So when we think about decolonizing batter intervention and how we look at patriarchy, we also have to look at how these systems are perpetuating our men and boys to engage in these behaviors. And that's, as Mr. Jack said, they can't express emotion. They're told to be tough, that they have to be the head of the household, that the weight of the finances and everything in the world is on them to take care of this family. But at the meantime, it creates this sense of entitlement. It creates a sense of a festering issue where it can turn into violence because it feels like an entitlement. It does in that sense. So when we talk about why or how our women might be committing these violences, or why our aunties and grandmothers and sisters might be engaging in these violences, it's all internalized, and that's what we're trying to unlearn. And I hope that that makes sense.
We have a question here in our last few minutes. Do you have any suggestions on how to speak to our older female relatives about internalized misogyny relating to how they enable the sunny boy behaviors? And then this could be specific to my family dynamic, but the older women in my family do welcome this subject openly.
Yeah.
Marquita.
That's a really great question. And I think that's a conversation that's starting to happen. And these spaces, I think, are the perfect time to have that conversation within our communities. I know from experience talking about this with my own mother, who gives so much grace to my brothers, but not the same to like me and my sisters. And I had to just ask her, like, why do you feel like your expectations for me are different from my brother? And what she said to me was, well, that's how it's always been. That's how we've always been taught. And it becomes really difficult, right? And I'm just, again, speaking from experience. I don't have the answer to that of how we have those conversations, but I think it's taking those baby steps, right? Talking to our elders and explaining and illustrating a little bit like what that means today. So I kind of explained the systems and some of those pieces to my mom so that it could kind of illustrate like how we get to this point. And there was some understanding between us, but what I want to say is that I think it starts with our children first. Those of us who are moms, fathers, aunties, uncles, grandparents that are grasping these concepts, is that if we're not, we can have those conversations with our elders, if they're open to it, but we also have to put it into practice too, right? Like we have to have that responsibility within kinship to talk to our young men and boys, talk to our young girls, that they deserve to live in a safe and healthy community, and that they are allowed to show up fully as themselves. And that includes emotions, that includes their ideas, that includes encouraging language with our young people. Mr. Jack, I'll give you the last couple minutes.
You mentioned how women's violence are a result of patriarchy. Yes, one of the unconventional research I did was on serial killers, and Aileen Wuornos, she killed 7 men, and that was because people were saying, or men were saying, women are more violent than men. So I did that. So I presented to them, yes, she did kill 7 men, and she was a prostitute, and those were the JOHNS. I don't like using that word because it's derogatory to me. Anyway, she was violent because of men's violence. She was raped at a young age and forced to marry a male relative, and that's how she ended up being violent, homeless, and a prostitute. So, and the other one was that there was 5 rapes were either in San Juan County or New Mexico, 5 rapes, and 2 of them were male male victims and 3 of them were female. And all 5 victims had male perpetrators. So a lot of times the women who perpetrate violence is because they experience violence from other men. And going back to the sonny boy thing, I can relate to that. I was a sonny boy. My mom coddled me. She had great expectations for my sisters, everything. I just did whatever a young boy would do. Boys will be boys, right? So yes, I understand, and I didn't really know it until I came across an article by Gayasi Ross, and it's titled "Fear of Our Loved Ones Flying Away." I'll email it to you so you can email it to everybody. And it illustrates this young man's behavior, given the past on all the things that he'd done. One of them was stealing a colt, shoving it into a trunk and having it die. And his mother defended him from the owner, saying that no, he didn't steal that. So I'll send that out, and it made me realize where a lot of that comes from. And you're right, it's because of the love, protection, coddling, and rather than and like I said, 3 females in my life without a father figure, and I found my father figures, my male role models, in destructive people. My relatives, my cousins, they were alcoholics, and that's how I kind of steered off the wrong way, also rebelled against my mother. Anyway, I'm glad to have been a presenter here.
Thank you so much, Mr. Jack. Really appreciate you showing up for us again. And we hope you can stay with us the rest of the training. But right now, I think we can go ahead and transition to lunch. I do want to thank you all for joining us. I hope to see you after. So please let me know if you have any questions. Send me a message in the DMs. I will be logged on through lunch, so let me know if there's any other information you like or any resources. I would be happy to help you with that. So with that, let's go ahead and take lunch. And since it's 12:03, you can come back at 1:05, and we'll see you then. Have a good lunch, everyone.